This man, Titus Oates, spent his early life going from failure to disappointment, from scandal to expulsion. It was a life of frustration and resentment. But in the late 1670s, he almost single-handedly turned England upside down. Approximately 30 people, most of them innocent, will be led to the gallows and will suffer the most hideous death of a traitor. Others will die in prison before their day of judgment comes, and all because of this man. The reign of King Charles II has often been seen as a golden age, the restoration of the monarchy, the merry monarch, a time of colour and laughter after the grey, oppressing days of Cromwell and the major generals. But in the next few years, as England swirled around the blood and horror of the Popish Plot, the myth of merry England soon disappears into the mire. So let's have a look at how this nightmare began and how close England came to civil war once more. Closer than you may think.
When the Duke of Monmouth returned covered in glory from the battlefield of Saint Denis, England was ready to bask in the King's son's eminence. As Monmouth stepped ashore, the King, the people, and most importantly, the Green Ribbon Club celebrated. But underneath the cries of welcome and adoration for this returning hero, England seethed with drama and conspiracy. Monmouth would need all his physical and mental courage as a new and deadly threat tore across the country. It all happened so unexpectedly and in such a strange quarter. The King would take a regular walk in St James's Park, and as was his custom, with minimal security. As he strolled along, waving to any passing onlookers, he was accosted by one Christopher Kirkby. Kirkby was a worker in the Royal Chemistry Laboratory. As the King was well known for his love of science and innovation, Kirkby may well have been known to him. The King challenged him. "What is the meaning of this?" "Sire, keep within the company, or you may be shot at any minute. A certain Dr. Israel Tongue has disclosed a plot, a Jesuit plot, to take your Majesty's life." And so began the Popish Plot, a twisted tale which over the years would turn England inside out. And in its macabre lifespan, many innocent men and women would be sent to their death, and in many cases, the worst death the state could conjure up for those who had committed treason. The King, never one to believe these conspiracies, called for Tongue and Kirkby, who were shown into the King's private chambers by his loyal servant Chiffinch. Charles did not seem overly bothered by the evidence, and expecting it to be a hoax. He ordered his Chief Minister Danby to investigate it at his leisure, then went to Windsor to welcome his son back from the wars. As Monmouth proceeded through the capital, he was made aware of the plot that was already gathering pace. As the man in charge of the King's security, he immediately doubled the guard on him, ordered the militia out, and made sure wherever the King went, he was to be accompanied by Monmouth himself. As the carriage rumbled through London, Tongue and Kirkby have already informed the Privy Council that one Titus Oates, a former and disgraced Anabaptist minister, had even more evidence for the King's immediate attention. But who was this strangely named man, who was once described as having his mouth in the middle of his face? A man whose past, which was so wretched and ill-fated, makes it unbelievable that anyone could have believed him. But they did.
Titus Oates was a rogue, a failure, one of life's disgruntled figures. As a young boy, he was expelled from school for troubles over money. At Cambridge, he was transferred to St John's, but again, disputes over money led to him being removed. Tales abounded about an argument where he refused to pay for a coat. Having failed at school and then university, he obtained a license to preach, but even now, this did not work out well for Oates. Accused of lewd and drunken behaviour, stealing and blasphemy, he was once more dismissed. With his life in tatters, he returned to Hastings, where, probably out of spite, or maybe he wanted the man's job, he accused a schoolmaster of sodomy with a pupil. This was most likely a fabrication, and the following uproar forced him to flee to London. Here he continued his CV of failure and dismissal, and was thrown out as a naval chaplain, and ironically, for sodomy.
It's all too clear to see that it is unbelievable that anyone was to believe him in the years to come. 1677 was the year that would change Oates and his fortunes. He converted to Catholicism. Oates would tell different audiences at different times why he converted to the Roman Catholic Church. Originally, he would say that it was a genuine conversion, and then later he would say that he had been seduced by Popish sirens. But whatever the reason, it seemed he had a benefactor who would protect and fund his work and travel. One Father Richard Strange, the head of the Jesuit order, looked after Oates. Some harsher historians have claimed that he supported Oates because both men were homosexual, whilst more lenient have said it was because Strange genuinely saw in Oates a real soul to be saved. But even with this support and guidance, Oates would fail. He was first sent to the English Catholic College in Valladolid, where he was dismissed. He was then sent to the college at Saint-Omer in France, and you guessed it, ended up in disgrace. But what of his partner in crime, Israel Tongue? Like Oates, he had had a life of many frustrations. He was in his 50s when the Popish Plot gathered pace. He was an educated academic, a holder of many degrees, and had been a chaplain to the army garrison of Dunkirk. Yet things also fell apart for Tongue. Dunkirk was sold back to France, meaning the garrison and Tongue had to return home. Gaining employment in London and with wages coming in, disaster was to strike in 1666. The Great Fire engulfed his church and his parish, leaving him penniless and looking for someone to blame. Like many others, he would blame the Catholics, but unlike many, he wanted vengeance. So the scene was set for Oates and Tongue, two frustrated and angry men who wanted to watch the world burn. And England, which was constantly in fear of a Catholic rebellion and invasion, was ripe for a plot to take hold. Ever since the Reformation, England had been struggling to keep the Catholic faith from resurfacing and forcing its way back into the English way of life. Fears of the Spanish Armada, the Gunpowder Plot, the Irish Rebellion of 1641 were embers that refused to be extinguished, and it took little work to turn them into a raging inferno. There was a permanent fear of being encircled by Catholic powers, with France and Spain just across the water and Ireland to the west. A Catholic uprising twinned with a foreign invasion was a constant concern for the authorities, and Oates and Tongue would play on these fears. It helped their cause that not only the Duke of York, the current heir to the throne, and the King's mistress, the Duchess of Portsmouth, were Catholics. Now, despite the King hardly taking this threat seriously, he had to be seen to at least hear the accusations. So there he sat with his council, whilst Oates, the renegade Catholic, who had stolen and eavesdropped information from Jesuit colleges, this gross, neckless figure, with an immense chin and low brow, explained this hellish plot from his cold lips in an ugly, affected drawl. Oates spoke confidently. "The Jesuits have offered to hire me and my friends to ambush and kill the King and the Duke of Monmouth as they drive to Newmarket, so that the Duke of York may ascend the throne and England be Romanised by the Jesuits. The Irish Catholics are to be raised in arms for a French-backed invasion, and the city, for the second time by Catholic torches, will be fired from end to end. By the Pope's orders, sir, the Jesuits have entered into negotiations with the Queen's physician and a priest of her household." Oates continued with his tale. 16,000 papists were waiting in hiding, ready to take London by sword. Invasion forces were gathering from all directions. 20,000 Scots, 5,000 cavalry in Ireland, as well as French troops ready to embark for Ireland. With these rumours reaching the London press, it did not take long before the cries of "41 has come again."
The Duke of Monmouth was front and centre in beginning the panicked process of removing Catholics from the army and the militia. But what exactly was the threat from Catholics in England? In the late 1670s, the Catholics of England would have made up approximately 1% of the population. This may not seem large enough to cause such an upheaval, but the underground nature of Catholicism at the time made people view it with suspicion and fear. Recusancy fines were still being issued for non-attendance at church and refusing to attend communion. Some of these fines could be as much as £20 a month. This may not seem much, but in the late 17th century, this could have been as much as £3,500.
But despite this minimal threat to England's security, the damage had been done, and Oates continued his line of persecution. With his insider knowledge of Catholic practices, he embellished and exaggerated day after day. Apart from the forcible conversion of England back to Rome, the planned assassination of King Charles was to be as nasty and painful as possible. Tales abounded about one Thomas Pickering who was to shoot the king. Tales of silver bullets, chewed bullets, so the wound would be more ghastly. Stories of Jesuits with foot-long daggers. It all built up a terrifying picture of a nightmare, not just avoided, but still ongoing. But why hadn't the king been killed already, asked the council. After all, the monarch's security was hardly spectacular. Oates, the well-practiced storyteller, had an answer, of course. He explained there had been occurrences of locks jamming in muskets, damp powder, a loose flint in a pistol. It was all too clear listening to Oates that the king had had many narrow escapes. As Oates's tale began to be believed and the noise of the mob increased, he began widening his net. As soon as he cast this wider net, he received a stroke of good fortune. One Edward Coleman, a secretary to the despised Duke of York and a Catholic agitator, had his rooms searched. Up in the chimney breast, a box was found which contained treasonous correspondence with papal nuncios and the French king's confessor, Père Lachaise. Danby immediately arrested Coleman and was flung into Newgate prison. Cries of Coleman's letters were enough to inflame the mob, and Parliament realised they had to act and that the public needed a blood sacrifice. There was no evidence that Coleman was involved in any assassination plot, except Oates's perjured testimony. Shaftesbury, the Whig Party, and the Green Ribbon Club were delighted. This surely was a clear indictment of the perils of the Duke of York as a successor to the throne. Surely the law must be overturned and Monmouth, their patron, made legitimate heir. It did seem that the London mob was in favour of ousting the Duke of York. Many Catholics were forced from their homes, anti-papist marches were held, and effigies of the Pope were burned in mass hysteria. These marches, pageants, carnivals, whatever we call them, were attended by vast numbers of people. Accounts state wildly exaggerated numbers, such as 200,000 people, but it must have been a heady and overpowering scene. There was clamour to get the best seats. Places in shop windows were being sold. It seemed that the Popish Plot was getting out of control. The main procession was planned, on purpose, to coincide with the accession date of Queen Elizabeth I, the 17th of November, a prized date in the Protestant calendar. The scale and terror of this procession can be summed up by the fact that in the main pyre on which the Pope's effigy was to be burned, they put live cats inside. So when the pyre was fired, the cat screams were to represent the Pope in hell.
But the most explosive and potentially dangerous event of the whole of the Popish Plot occurred just after Oates had given sworn evidence to one magistrate, Sir Edmund Godfrey. Godfrey, a respected Protestant magistrate, suddenly went missing for several days. Rumour again once more took charge, and a general search was planned. Eventually, he was found on Primrose Hill, in a ditch, and dead. Not only dead, but clearly murdered, strangled, and with his own sword run through him in some strange foreign ritual.
Godfrey would overnight become a martyr of the Protestant cause. He soon appeared on medals and coins and playing cards, but his murderer has never been discovered. So you would think that Oates had done enough and that the Duke of York, his main target, would be sent into exile and a new Protestant heir would be named. But no, not yet, and mainly because, like everything else in Oates's life, he eventually failed. He went too far, accused the wrong people, and just as importantly, the more the plot grew, the more unreliable and discreditable figures were questioned, and the evidence became more flaky and less reliable. One of his mistakes was accusing Dr. Wakeman, the Queen's physician. Oates claimed that the Queen herself had encouraged and paid the physician to poison the king. When the trial was in progress, Sir William Scroggs ensured he questioned on his evidence thoroughly. Scroggs pressed hard and was even recorded to say, "To take a man's life on oath, that is murder."
Through this interrogation, Scroggs found enough gaps in Oates's testimony to get Wakeman off. But the closeness of this forced the king to act, and publicly. For if he didn't, having the Queen involved in this plot could lead to a complete disaster.
He was soon interviewing Oates himself, determined to find cracks in his tale. At one point, when Oates mentioned Don John of Austria, Charles ordered Oates to describe him.
"For rough Irishmen and stabbed by colliers, or after?
In case one attempt should fail...
And if all else should fail, was I to be smothered by barbarous nuns or kicked to death by the Pope's donkey? Describe Don John of Austria."
He is tall, dark, and lean.
"Like all Spaniards. I know him well. He's short, fair, and stout. Damn the attendant."
This all started to add to the number of men who were beginning to believe that Oates was lying. But so much damage had already been done. Danby was eventually impeached, the Duke of York was forced into exile, men and women had been imprisoned and executed. A 20-mile exclusion zone had been put in place around London, and the fear and hatred between Catholics and Protestants had been widened even more. And yet, despite the utter confusion and blood, the king wasn't assassinated, and in the end, the plot slowly faded away.
And of course, what of Oates? What was his punishment for fabricating this mountain of lies? A mountain which claimed dozens of lives. He was discredited, and by 1684, when the Duke of York had regained his superiority at court, acted swiftly against Oates. Oates was thrown in prison for perjury, pilloried where people could throw vegetables and rubbish at him. He was lashed and whipped twice through London, and fined the colossal sum of £100,000. But no matter what was thrown at him, he survived, and following the glorious revolution of 1688 and William of Orange's ascent to the throne, he was released. He received a small pension and passed away in 1727.
And so ended the Popish Plot and the hideous lies of Titus Oates. A period of years where innocent people were executed, soldiers smashed open doors to take people away, a time where the government lost control of the press and fake news flooded the streets of London. An event which ensnared common and famous individuals. Even Samuel Pepys was caught in its tentacles. Being close to the Duke of York in his role in the Admiralty of the Navy, he was charged with piracy, popery and treachery and imprisoned. Finally released on bail for £30,000, over £5 million in today's money. And what about our hero, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth? He has kept the king safe and come through this tumultuous period unscathed. But his next challenge will be a lot closer and more personal. He will be heading north and taking the fight to the Covenanters at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge. The mystery of the black box again took centre stage during the troubles of the Popish Plot. If you'd like to see our video on whether King Charles II was married to Monmouth's mother, Lucy Walter, click here and find out whether Monmouth really was the rightful heir to the throne. As always, thanks for watching.